The world energy markets, as a result of the war in Ukraine, have been thrown into a mayhem. The U.S. and the Europeans are pressuring Russia, albeit in different degrees. But have we entered a new world energy order due to the Ukraine conflict, post-Putin? Hi, I'm Kaveh Taghvai, and in this edition of Economic Divide, we will look at how the world energy landscape has changed, maybe for good. Coming up in this program, the U.S. has barred Russian oil imports, looking for alternatives. Meanwhile, Europe has diverged from the U.S., announcing that by mid-May, we will come up with a proposal to get off Russian oil, gas, and coal by 2027. Was there a divergence there? Next up, the U.S. left in a cold. Well, Russia's partnership with the top oil producers like Saudi Arabia, jointly leading the OPEC coalition, has so far stayed intact, but the U.S. pressure has not worked. Does that mean that the U.S. is left out in the cold as a result? And then finally, the new world energy order emerging after Putin. Is this what we are looking at as a result of the Ukraine conflict? Are fresh alliances and blocs aligning with each other from West Asia to Russia itself and beyond? Is an Eastern pivot taking shape? The crisis between Russia and Ukraine has wreaked havoc in global oil markets. Russia plays a pivotal role in the global energy supply, and destabilization could send shockwaves to the global economy. It is the third biggest producer of oil in the world, behind the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. It produces around 7 million barrels of oil per day, which is about 7% of global oil supply. Russian imports account for 8% of total UK oil demand. More than 40% of what it produces every day goes to Europe. The U.S. is less reliant, with about 3% of its imported oil coming from Russia. Oil prices have reached their highest levels in years. Experts warn sanctions on Russia's energy products could be catastrophic for the global economy. They say the global economy could be facing one of the largest energy supply shocks ever. There are now warnings that prices of oil per barrel could reach $180 to $200.
Here in the United States, we've imported 200,000 barrels a day. We imported about 450,000 barrels of product, mostly unfinished distillate, that we run through the refinery to boost yields on the other end of the refinery. It comes out more distillate, more gasoline. We don't really need those 200 barrels. We don't need those 450,000 barrels. So we can definitely exist without that. It's a spit in the bucket. The Eurozone, we're talking percentage points, double digits. So it's a totally different game.
Russia has already warned that prices could reach $300 per barrel if the West decides to shun its oil and gas from the markets. Supply shortages, bottlenecks, and price pressures caused by the coronavirus pandemic have already disrupted the global economy, and there are fears that further price shocks would have catastrophic consequences. The whole notion of sanctioning a country is to make the governing body suffer, and not the ordinary citizens. But that may not be the case when it comes to the U.S. in particular, than the Europeans. Let's see what people had to say about that in our social media section of the program. Well, this person has the right idea, even though the UK is too entrenched in this already. The UK should stay out of the Russia-Ukraine war, apart from that, to de-escalate and then try to bring the fighting to an end. Do not enact a no-fly zone, do not send weapons, and stop ramping up sanctions against all of Russia. That only hurts ordinary people rather than what he or this person says is the regime there. Next one, what a display of duplicity and hypocrisy of Europe's leaders. How can they expect Russia to supply gas, fuel, while their non-military entities, artists, sportspersons, ordinary people are being hit by sanctions? How will Germany or Hungary pay for energy with no SWIFT links? Next one, we do not support Joe Biden's sanctions on Russia. Sanctions will only hurt ordinary Americans by further hiking up gas prices. Biden's already slashed domestic production, and the Saudis have declined to raise output. Well, this new sanctions package will cripple America, not Russia. And finally, you're hurting Americans at the pump. Your sanctions are going to hurt us more than Russia, and the only ones in Russia that would be hurt are ordinary people there, just like the ones that you're hurting here at home. Open up the pipelines and drop all federal fuel taxes. Okay, some of the social media posts which seem to agree with us in terms of how ordinary people are suffering. Okay, joining us in this segment of the Q&A is Attilio Boran. He's a political scientist and international analyst who joins us from Buenos Aires. Attilio Boran, welcome. We're taking a look at obviously what has happened with this conflict, Russia's military operation, which has shocked the oil markets. Looking for replacements has been something that the U.S. is after, but hasn't been successful. In the meantime, obviously, Europe is wanting to go with the U.S., but finding a replacement for oil and gas is a tough thing. What is your assessment as to whether this can be done to help the ordinary people who are suffering the most here?
Not at all. The world is hungry and thirsty of consuming oil, so there will be no problem for the Russian. Of course, there will be will be necessary to make some adjustments in all the pipelines which Russia has developed, but there is no question that they could divert the proportion, a high proportion at least, of the oil that they were exporting to Russia to the south.
That's indeed going to be a challenge also. Our next guest, Carlos Martinez, joins us from London. He is an activist and political analyst. Carlos Martinez, welcome to the program. If we were to take a look at an ulterior motive that the U.S. may have on this, it has pointed to its shale gas. And of course, that involves fracking. But we know the hazards that are involved with that environmentally. At the same time, the inferior quality that consists shale gas. How can that even be used to provide shortages, for example, in the case of Europe? Is that even feasible?
Yeah, it's a really important question that's been largely ignored, actually. You know, with the advent of fracking, hydraulic fracturing of shale rock, the US has gone from being an energy importer to being an energy exporter. Now, in terms of the current crisis in Europe, that has a couple of consequences. Firstly, the US isn't really worried so much about sanctioning Russian energy because it's not reliant on it. Secondly, the US gets a positive benefit because it means a bigger market for US energy. That's why the US has been for years trying to scupper the Nord Stream 2 project, because they don't want to see Europe dependent on Russian energy, and they do want to see Europe dependent on American energy. Obviously, for European consumers, this turn to shale is a disaster because fracking is much more expensive, and to be transported across the Atlantic, fracked gas has to be converted to liquid. It has to be stored at, maybe minus 60 degrees centigrade, pumped thousands of kilometers. So that's an expensive process.
It's time now for our Info News section of the program, where we searched and are now ready to present to you some economic news from around the world. Well, you guessed it, it's hard to look for economic news where the Russia-Ukraine conflict is not involved. Like this particular piece of news that comes from the UK. UK farmers are warning that soaring gas costs could cut food production. Farmers there are looking at a drop of up to 50% in the amount that they can afford to grow because of the soaring energy costs that are happening in that country. Of course, that's something that the UK is going to be grappling for quite some time. Moving out to the next topic here, premature pullout is the title we've given it. That could be the case of foreign companies that pulled out of Russia. Russia announced it plans to seize assets of Western companies that have pulled out of the country. The Russian President Vladimir Putin preparing economic retaliation for Western sanctions. That includes laws to impound $10 billion of leased airline jets. Russia said it could take temporary control of the departing businesses where foreign ownership exceeds 25%. All right, up to the next crisis. West Asia and North African countries are facing a severe wheat crisis over the Ukraine crisis. West Asia and North African countries are they rely heavily on wheat imports from Russia and also from Ukraine, with around 70% of its wheat coming from both of those countries. Some 80% of Tunisia's grain also hails from these two countries. Lebanon, 60% of its wheat comes from Ukraine, so you can see how that obviously spells disaster for those countries when it comes to wheat. And finally, this country has had a fallout with the IMF before over loans and defaulting on it, but both are eager to get back into it again. But why? We're looking at Argentina, in which you have a $45 billion IMF loan that IMF has agreed with that country. Again, there have been loan defaults from Argentina. There was a case back in 1994 where they were heavily involved in a feud when it came to the fact that Argentina felt its sovereignty was violated. The government was going to default on a $19 billion repayment. That's part of the reason why it actually went for that loan. Well, those were the stories that we thought would be okay for this program for us to cover, but we're more interested if you send your suggestions or your ideas to us. We would love to hear from you. Instead of relying on getting news from the net, it would be better to have you make a suggestion. These are our addresses. When it comes to the U.S. sanctions on Russia, the U.S. went from being somewhat in doubt or hesitant about sanctioning Russia's oil and energy sector. And then from that, it went to a full-fledged trade embargo. Full-fledged, that meant no Russian imports and no trade with Russia. But at what cost? Did the U.S. really think about that? Well, we're going to be taking a look at some of those aspects. First, we're going to pose this question: how do U.S. sanctions on Russia affect the West? Well, the only way to look at it is through the numbers, and here you have one of them. Russia's oil and gas exports account for 25% of global exports. That's a quarter of global exports that Russia accounts for. Next up, the impact on the U.S. It imported an average of over 20.4 million barrels of crude oil and refined petroleum products from Russia, and that was each month for the year 2021, which accounted for 8% of U.S. liquefied fuel imports. As a result, you're looking at an average gasoline price, $4.07 per gallon nationally. Insider in the industry are concerned if it hits $200 per barrel, we may be looking at prices at the pump even going higher than that. And that's a possibility. Inflation is now a concern. The U.S. CPI surged to 7.5% in January, the fastest annual rise in 40 years, with sanctions on Russia putting more pressure, obviously, on inflation. Food, electricity, and shelter, the biggest drivers of inflation. Energy prices, as you can see, up 27%. And Goldman Sachs saying that if oil reaches $150 per barrel, we're looking at even more when it comes to energy costs. Now the EU. Russia is the largest single energy source in the EU. If Russian gas exports are banned, it's going to be tough to bring it from other places. A third of the EU's natural gas and a quarter plus of its crude oil comes from Russia also. There are different aspects to this, but who is going to bear the most brunt, the worst part of it? Germany, the largest economy in Europe, more than half of Germany's natural gas, and over 30% of its crude oil supply comes from Russia. Germany has come out along with the EU making a statement that perhaps they're going to put the brakes on banning Russian oil, and they may go in phases. Who knows? There's still a little on one side or the other when it comes to the way that they're going to approach this. Okay, people are bearing the brunt of this. That is what we're focusing on. And here is a case in point, which we obviously are going to take a look at the average people in the U.S. and what they think about what is happening regarding the oil prices and, of course, the conflict in Ukraine.
Not good. The price of gas is going up, and for this, I got an 8-cylinder engine in here, and I use about $20 every 2 days to try to. I just try to get as much miles as I can out of what I'm doing, you know. But gas prices are going to go up.
And the increase of the gas is keep increasing every day. It's keep going up, and the jobs are going decent, going down. Every day it's going down. So it's affecting my budget. It's affecting everybody.
I would rather have high gas prices here than an authoritarian regime in the Ukraine. So if we have to suffer with a little bit of inflation in gas prices for a while to assure that such a wonderful country as Ukraine has an opportunity to develop its democracy, we should do that.
Well, it might be easy for her to say that because I think I saw her pumping actually gasoline into her BMW. Anyways, let's get some analysis into this. We have Atilla Boran, who's a political scientist and international analyst, who rejoins us. Atilla Boran, Shell producers in the U.S., they stand to obviously benefit from what is going on here. When we take a look at what is happening with sanctions, however, that's what I'd like to focus with you. Do you think that these sanctions that they're placing against Russia is actually going to work in terms of the intended, I guess, purposes that the U.S. has, and in turn the EU, which appears to be following the lead of the U.S.?
Well, you know, I don't think that Mr. Biden has thought over all the implications of these policies of sanctions, because experience shows that sanctions do not work. How many years have been the United States sanctioning other countries? Take the case of Cuba, more than 60 years. Take the case of Iran, 20, 25 years at least. And I don't think this is going to really have a dramatic impact on Russia. Of course, it will create some difficulties to the Russian people, but I don't think that the American expectations, a sort of collapse of Russia because of the sanctions, is not going to happen.
Okay. Well, Carlos Martinez, activist and political analyst, rejoins us from London to understand from him what is happening here. Carlos Martinez, welcome back. You're looking at a situation where European gas prices are trading for what we understand at $500 per barrel. Another stat that's very alarming: 40 million UK citizens heading for fuel poverty. Americans obviously are also kind of suffering, as we just played with gas prices. U.S. may reap the benefits because of its geopolitical intentions, but what about Europeans? First of all, will Russia have oil buyers, and how Europe is going to cope with all of this?
Well, to be honest, I don't know if Europe will cope. 40 million UK citizens in fuel poverty is nearly 2/3 of the population. And obviously we're not talking about the wealthy, we're talking about ordinary working class and middle income people who are paying the price of this war in a very real way. Ordinary people actually in Britain and Europe benefit not one bit from an escalating war in Ukraine, from NATO's expansion, from aggression against Russia. Actually, given a choice and presented with the facts of the situation, they would much rather have peace in Europe, and there's an opportunity for peace. If NATO is willing to engage on Russia's security concerns, which are not in the least bit unreasonable, then the crisis could end tomorrow. Meanwhile, the imposition of unprecedented, unilateral, illegal sanctions isn't going to bring the war to an end. It's going to extend the war. Meanwhile, it's causing significant suffering for ordinary people in the very countries that are issuing the sanctions. Is it causing suffering in Russia as well? Absolutely. There's no question that these sanctions are going to hit Russian people hard. For all this talk of targeting so-called oligarchs, it's perfectly obvious that if you impose this kind of economic blockade, it's going to impact living standards. However, you look at the list of countries that's sanctioning Russia, it's the usual suspects. It's the US, it's Britain, it's the EU. Meanwhile, China, India, Iran, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, these countries aren't joining in with the sanctions. So Russia does at least have the possibility of bypassing this crisis to some degree.
The administration of U.S. President Joe Biden has imposed an immediate ban on Russian oil and other energy imports. Sanctions on Russia's oil and gas industry had once been viewed as mostly off the table, as officials in the U.S. and Europe were worried about a global spike in prices. The United Kingdom said that it would phase out imports of Russian oil and oil products by the year 2022, while the European Union said it would slash Russian gas imports to Europe by 66% by the end of the year.
By the end of this year, we can replace 100 BCM of gas imports from Russia. That is 2/3 of what we import from them. This will end our over-dependency and give us much-needed room to maneuver. 2/3. It's hard, bloody hard, but it's possible if we're willing to go further and faster than we've done before.
The U.S. imported an average of 209,000 barrels per day of crude oil and 500,000 barrels per day of other petroleum products from Russia in 2021. The full embargo would be most effective if it included European allies. Yet, it is far from clear that all of Europe would take part in an embargo. While the U.S. could replace the fuel it receives from Russia, Europe cannot immediately replace its energy imports from that country. Any curbs on Russian oil exports could send already skyrocketing oil and gasoline prices even higher and further squeeze businesses, financial markets, and the global economy.
We'll probably see gasoline trade even higher. Today was the highest level for gasoline at the pump basically ever in the United States. So not a good situation, not a good inflationary situation, really not a good political situation for the Democratic Party, who is in power. And yeah, it's going to put upward pressure on all those issues.
The surging oil prices and threats of further sanctions on Russia's oil industry has pushed up gasoline prices in the U.S., with prices hitting above $4 a gallon of regular gas. In some states, the prices have already reached beyond $5 per gallon. The end of the Omicron surge and the removal of many COVID restrictions is encouraging people to get out of the house for more shopping, entertainment, and travel as well. U.S. trips in passenger vehicles have increased 25% since the beginning of the year, and that has pushed up demand for more gasoline in the U.S.
One of the things that is not so evident in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is the energy interests when it comes to the U.S., and that is worth taking a look at. First, there is the issue of Russia's military operation in Ukraine. The U.S. has been very keen in pumping Ukraine with arms and military equipment. It has rallied other countries, especially NATO countries, to do the same. Yet it has refused to participate in the conflict militarily, instead throwing Ukraine into the fire. But why would the U.S. do that, knowing that there would be an energy crisis as a consequence that could grip the entire world, as it has already? For one thing, the U.S., unlike the Europeans, has plenty of oil reserves. Based on one stat from 2019, the U.S. proved reserves as of December 31st, 2019 was 44.2 billion barrels. But the Europeans, in contrast, can't enjoy the same privilege. In contrast, in 2020, Russia had 107.8 billion barrels worth of oil reserves, but that can't be counted anymore. In comparison, Norway had 7.9 billion barrels, which is the largest in Europe. But here is where there might be an incentive for the U.S. to eliminate Russia oil from the market: U.S. shale gas. Just in October 2020, U.S. oil producers were on pace for the most bankruptcies since a last oil downturn. A slew of restructurings took place that put oil and gas producers on track for their biggest year of bankruptcies. The amounts are staggering. 36 producers with $51 billion in debt filed for bankruptcy protection in the first 8 months of the year. Now, the U.S. shale producers are merging and are on track to come back online with a breath of new life pumped into them. But not so fast. This shale oil and gas is not the greatest product. It's more inferior and harms the environment tremendously. Its quality is nowhere near Russian oil and gas, for example. Hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling poisons groundwater, pollutes surface water, impairs landscapes, and threatens wildlife. And that does it for this section. From me, Mahdi, it's goodbye until the next program.
When the U.S. president announced a ban on all imports of Russian oil and gas, he knew what it would do to Americans. He even said, "I'm going to do everything I can to minimize Putin's price hike here at home." But what does he mean by that? I mean, ordinary Americans are having a hard time dealing with this. But what about the poor, or the ones who are struggling to put food on the table? Does he have a game plan for them? Probably not when it comes to them. Just like he does not have a real strategy behind how to actually replace Russia's oil. Only time will tell how he's going to go about that. That does it for this edition of the program. It was great having you. Of course, we look forward to any questions or comments that you may have. Do send them to us. From me, Kaveh Tarvei, and the entire team, it's goodbye until next time.